Good morning, everybody. This is Tom Gretsch from the Queens Chamber of Commerce, calling and reaching out from the global headquarters at the Boulevard Corporate Center. A pleasure to have you all here today. This is a very, very exciting time, I think, for New York, and I think especially, and in particular, for Queens County and the surrounding areas, but especially Queens. Between our $12 or $13 billion airport expansion at JFK, which was recently announced, two different projects in 1 week by the governor, and the end in sight for the LaGuardia expansion, we are on a roll here in Queens. It gives me great honor and privilege to have our friends at the RPA, so capably led by Tom Wright, the president and CEO, to make a presentation today about the Interborough Express. Before I turn over the camera and the mics to our friends at the RPA, a couple of quick things. For those of you who can see this, I'm wearing my transportation tie, which is a microcosm of the New York transportation scene via the New York City subway line. It has been said over the course of my 6 years at the chamber that I've never met a transportation project I didn't fall in love with and didn't like. This is one of those projects. I got the earful a couple of years ago from Carlos Asura, who used to run the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce and now runs the Building Congress and soon to be the head of the New York City EDC, that I should look into this project that the RPA had worked on for years, and I have been. But I must admit, I was happily surprised when the governor made it a focal point of her State of the State last week. From the third track on Long Island to the East Side access, and as importantly, so close to home, the LaGuardia Air Train, which, as folks know, is still under review and will be re-reviewed by 3 experts the governor has chosen to work with the Port Authority on. We're very excited about transport. I will say my 2 cents on this Interborough Express is it's a great time to look at all of these different rail projects in a very, very holistic way, whether it's the Long Island Railroad access, other MTA projects, this Interborough Express, and yes, folks, the LaGuardia Air Train. I think it's critically important to do a holistic approach and find some way to link the Interborough Express with on-site rail service to LaGuardia Airport in some way, shape, or form. And that's what I'm going to say about that right now. But long story short, I'm very happy to introduce 2 different folks from the RPA that we consider partners and collaborators with. And that's first Maulin Mehta, who is the New York director of the Regional Plan Association, and Kate Slevin, executive vice president at the Regional Plan Association. Maulin and Kate, welcome. The floor is yours. And thanks again for doing this for the members of the Queens Chamber of Commerce and the Queens public at large.
Thank you so much, Tom. And it was really great to see you in person and live yesterday at the governor's announcement about the Interborough in Bay Ridge. So great to see you. Thank you so much for having us. And we're hoping that we can continue to collaborate on so many issues, transportation, otherwise across the county. So I'm going to get started here and talk a little bit about RPA and our history and our work as it relates to this project. And then I will pass it over to Maulin. So next slide, please, Maulin. So RPA, Regional Plan Association, is a nonprofit research planning and advocacy group. And we essentially work to improve the quality of life of the 23 million residents in the New York City region. We have been around 100 years. This is our centennial year, so congrats to us for that. And we are a relatively small group, but we like to think that we definitely get out there as much as possible. We're urbanists, urban planners, researchers, advocates, and communications specialists. Next, please. This is our region. 3 states, over 780 municipalities, one of which is New York City. So we see things through a regional lens, and we get the pleasure of working with different types of communities, from rural communities to very dense urban areas found in New York City. Next, please. And so we've been around for, like I said, 100 years, and we've consistently worked on the same issues: transportation, energy and environment, and protecting open space, housing and neighborhood planning, and governance as well. Next slide. And true to our name, we put out an actual regional plan every generation. Our first regional plan was in the 1920s, and our last one was put out, our fourth regional plan was put out in 2017. And I just want to take a minute here to talk a little bit about the impact of those plans and how they've progressed over time, because I do think it's very relevant to the conversation we're having today regarding the Interborough. So RPA was organized in the 1920s by business leaders like yourselves who were actually worried about the poor quality of life and overcrowding in Manhattan. And they were concerned about a lack of vision for growth and development. Coming together and thinking about regional growth and development at that time was groundbreaking, and it really hadn't been done before. And so we essentially set out to do that over the course of some years. We put together a plan. Now our 1920s plan really was an emphasis on highways and improving travel by a car. This was sort of new at the time. The founders of RPA kind of saw this as a way to allow the region to sprawl out a little bit. At that time, they saw that as a positive because the Manhattan was so very crowded and there were so many challenges there. So as part of this, we recommended a 2,500-mile highway program, which included things like the Cross Bronx, the BQE, many of the highways you see today, along with a series of arterial parkways. You know them well, Belt Parkway, Henry Hudson, East River Drive. Many of those were built. And we also recommended that the George Washington Bridge, which was originally supposed to go in at 57th Street, come up through 178th Street, because we sort of saw a future where regional connectivity was more important than just getting into and out of Manhattan. And as you can see, like as you know, many of these highways have been constructed. We also recommended a series of commuter rail networks. Some of that was constructed, some of that was not. For better or worse, our highway plans were adopted and put in place. And it's worth saying that we have always been very focused on encouraging open space protection. Great Hills Park in Staten Island, Palisades Interstate Park System, Garrett Mountain Reservation in Patterson. These ideas were all in the first regional plan 100 years ago. And it's worth noting that in the 1920s, this line we're going to talk about today, the Bay Ridge line, actually had passenger service on. I did not know that until Jano Lieber said it yesterday at the announcement, and they had passenger service on it until I think 1924. So the second regional plan we put out in 1968, and over the series of these decades, the growth and development in the New York City region was quite different. It had become very sprawl oriented, very car oriented. And so the concerns were different. It was about trying to focus in more and focus on centers, put investment in regional centers in New York City, get more people onto transit, build more transit projects. And we actually recommended that we needed federal funding for transit projects to be able to grow and prosper in a way that didn't encourage pollution, in a way that allowed equitable mobility. And this was authorized as the Urban Mass Transit Act a few years later. Other investments, the Gateway National Recreation Area, Fire Island National Seashore, we all put all of that in the second regional plan in 1968. We also recommended in that plan a series of centers, including Jamaica. We said this can really be a center point for the region. We need investment in Jamaica. We need investment in places like downtown Brooklyn, Jersey City, and we've seen some of this come to fruition over the decades. Our third regional plan was put out in 1996. And again, it's decades from the 60s to the 90s, so much changed in New York. The region was facing years of slow growth and uncertainty, disinvestment in infrastructure, social divisiveness, and environmental degradation. And so a cornerstone of RPA's third regional plan was essentially the recognition that the region's continued prosperity and global standing were no longer guaranteed. We once again, in order to get out of this situation, recommended a series of investments in our centers. Again, we talked a lot about Jamaica and Newark and Bridgeport and other places in the region we saw as these small centers that would really be hubs for job growth and economic growth. And transit projects were a cornerstone to allowing this vision to play out. certain transit projects that everyone at the time thought were really pipe dreams, the Second Avenue subway, East Side Access, and of course, this a new 24-mile transit service, which we're about to talk about momentarily, along freight tracks in Brooklyn and Queens, was also part of it. And we called it the Triboro RX. So this is back in 1996 that we first started talking about this idea. And the Triboro RX is now being called the Interborough. And you're going to hear a little bit more about that today in a minute. In the 90s, we also recommended more investment in public transit. We recommended ways to manage traffic congestion, i.e. congestion pricing, which has been authorized by the state and will be implemented in a year or so. We recommended investment in the waterfronts and really things that we've seen come to fruition in the city. And so in 2017, we did our last regional plan. And I think at this moment in time, a cornerstone of that was that we didn't have the capacity we needed to grow. So many people want to be in New York City, in the region, but our housing crisis, our lack of investment in infrastructure, inequality, were all becoming such problems for us that it was really limiting our growth. So we actually looked at a scenario where we grew at a much faster pace than what was going on, because we saw the limits were actually constraints on housing, constraints on transit, and essentially was stopping people from coming to the region. So the reason we called for a lot of these investments, and Maulin, I think you can move to the next slide now. The reason we called for a lot of these investments is that we saw that the job growth was really happening in the outer boroughs, much more than it had in previous generations. And that we saw as a positive thing. But again, we didn't have the transit service. We didn't have the policies and projects in place to support that growth. So you can move to the next slide. And these are just some slides about the fourth plan. We had various values incorporated into it: equity, health, prosperity, and sustainability. And these are the values that really drive everything we talk about and everything we support, including the Interborough. Maulin, next slide. So in the fourth plan, we had a series of 161 recommendations. I'm not going to bore you with all of them, but it is worth noting that we really wanted to create a dynamic, customer-oriented transportation network. Transportation has been a real focus for RPA since our inception 100 years ago. And so we call for things like the Triboro, which we'll talk about more in a minute. We'll see a map of it, I think, on the next slide. And we also talked about other things, like we talked about reconstructing the subway system in 15 years. The MTA at the time we put this out in 2017, I think had a 50-year plus time horizon to upgrade the signals. We said, no, you got to get it done faster. It's got to be quicker than that. We wanted to really speed up buses because they're much more comprehensive in their coverage of New York City. Just we really don't use it, and they're not as reliable as they should be. And so we called for investments in that and speeding up that service. We called for a series of investments in the regional transit network, such as the new Gateway program, which includes new transit tunnels under the Hudson River, which we hope will eventually improve access to Queens via future projects. And really interborough connectivity, because we saw a lot of the job growth coming to the outer boroughs. And so the interborough is a key element of that. Next slide. Great, and I don't have to tell you all this as Queens people. The rail system was really designed primarily to get people in and out of Manhattan. And it's been a challenge, for since going back all of RPA's history to try and support the other regional hubs that are not Manhattan, whether it's Jamaica, whether it's downtown Brooklyn, whether it's Sunnyside or even White Plains or Bridgeport. We've really tried to push for investments that benefit the regional centers, because we know Manhattan can't do it all itself. Next slide, please. And one challenge we've seen for a very long time, as I talked about a minute ago, It's just the bus network. It is so comprehensive. So many more people in New York are actually close to a bus system, but they don't use it because the buses are so slow. So there's now ambitious plans to get more protected bus lanes, more cleaner buses, faster buses out on the streets, and that is in the works. But that's not going to solve everything. And so you really need stronger interborough transit connections. Next slide. So over the course of the fourth plan, as we were putting it together, we talked to folks from all across the region. And here's some of the transit challenges we heard from folks, especially in Brooklyn and Queens. And I think a lot of these will be familiar to you. No north-south connections, so very hard to get between the boroughs. Up to an hour for an interborough commute outside Manhattan, because you actually have to go through Manhattan to get to any of the other boroughs. At the same time, a lot of people said, look, we've seen all this job growth happen in our community, but people aren't able to get to it. Or I have a job, you know, in the Bronx or in Brooklyn from Queens, but I can't get to my job because it takes me an hour and a half each way on the local bus system. So these are some of the things we heard and some of the things that really reinforced our push for better interborough connections. Maulin, next slide, please. And so this is the RPA's initial proposal for the Triboro that really built off our ideas in our third regional plan in the 1990s. And you can see here, these tracks are all already there, and they run from Brooklyn, or Sunset Park, the Brooklyn Army Terminal, north all the way to Co-op City. And so this is a 24-mile line. And it is an existing right of way. Maulin's going to talk a little bit more about who owns it and how it's operated now. And we estimated in 2016, 2017, the ridership would be about 100,000 daily. And then it would take a couple $2 billion to build this thing. And you can see these are some of our proposed station stops along the route. Obviously, what is actually going to happen might look different than this. It might look the same. We don't know, but this was our proposal based on what we knew, based on talking to people, based on the infrastructure that was there. And so with that, I think we're going to play a little video and you'll recognize the narration because it's me. And then Maulin is going to talk a little bit more specifically about the interborough and how it's different from the Triboro and how it will benefit Brooklyn, Queens as we move forward. So I'll be back in a minute. Enjoy the video. For more than a century, New York City's rail network has focused on getting people in and out of Manhattan, leaving 6.5 million people in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens with too few transit options. It's time to bring better transit to the boroughs with the Triboro, a new 24-mile transit line extending from Co-op City in the Bronx to Bay Ridge in Brooklyn. The Triboro would use existing tracks, making it simpler and cheaper to build than brand new train lines or subways. If we build Triboro, we can connect 17 subway lines, 4 commuter rail lines, and dozens of bus lines, helping 100,000 New Yorkers each day get where they need to go. It would reduce the time it takes to get to work, to school, or to see friends. A student from Jackson Heights could shave 30 minutes off their trip to Brooklyn College. The tracks are already there. Let's put them to use for all New Yorkers.
Thanks, Kate. Nice to always see that video. So as Kate talked about, the idea for the Triboro really has been kicking around for a few decades now. But since the fourth regional plan and in subsequent years, we really ramped up the advocacy around the line. So from 2018 to 2019, for example, we spent a lot of time meeting with stakeholders educating them about the project, holding events, and creating some of the public-facing materials like that video that you just saw. And through this advocacy work, we really succeeded in getting a range of stakeholders to support the project and call on the MTA to initiate a feasibility study. At the time, council member, now Brooklyn Borough President Antonio Reynoso, helped lead a council letter. Assembly member Latrice Walker proposed legislation that would have required the MTA to initiate the study. And the reason we were asking for a feasibility study request was to really get more of the technical analysis done to make the project real. It's one thing for advocates and planners like us to see an opportunity to utilize infrastructure and assets that are already there. It's another to have the engineers and the lawyers take a look at it, see what's actually needed to make it a reality. And so, towards the end of 2019, we were really excited that the MTA announced funding the feasibility study. And, I think it was a combination of a really popular project, a lot of stakeholder support, but really it was the merits of the project, I think, that led the agency to take it on. As Kate talked about, there was a lot of increased job growth and population growth in the outer boroughs, and there was a need to really rethink how our transit system operates. And now here we are, 2 years later, we see that the governor, the MTA, and so many other of our leaders are aligned in a vision to move a part of the vision forward. So on this map, we worked with our old graphic designer to just show the Interborough as it relates to the Triboro line. And it's the portion of the line that runs from Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, up to Jackson Heights in Queens. And while it is 10 miles less, our full Triboro line is 24 miles. This is 14 miles. It still has a really tremendous impact for residents in Queens and Brooklyn. And the MTA's initial ridership estimate is at almost 90,000 daily riders, connections to, again, 17 subway lines, the Long Island Railroad, and the bus network that crisscrosses in between. So, it's a tremendous game changer for Brooklyn, Queens, for the city, really, because it just allows people to get around more efficiently. And I just want to, talk about this directly. There are a number of constraints that likely led to the decision to stick with the Bay Ridge to Jackson Heights portion of the line. And I think on this map really highlights one of the bigger constraints, which is that there are 3 owners of the line. It's not that the MTA actually controls the entire portion. Of the Interborough Express line, which runs 14 miles, 11 of those miles are actually controlled by the Long Island Railroad on the Bay Ridge branch line, and CSX controls 3 miles. And so just having that control over the line makes it much easier and reduces the amount of constraints that the MTA would have in order to kind of move forward with building out the project. And then the other, another big factor to take into consideration is that there is a tremendous investment happening in the East Bronx with the Penn Access project. This will expand Metro North service to the same areas that we have proposed that Triboro be expanded to. And it's going to be a tremendous asset, shaving almost 50 minutes off for residents in the East Bronx that are commuting into Manhattan. But obviously, this creates challenges because of capacity along the existing line. Both Penn Access and Triboro would use the same corridor. And so our understanding right now is that the Hellgate Bridge, which brings service from Astoria up into the Bronx, will be at capacity once this Penn Access project is complete. And so what that would mean is that in order to also extend the Interborough at this time would require possibly the extension of a new bridge, new aqueduct, new acquisition of property, and a lot of things that could potentially jeopardize the entire project because of the time, costs, and construction needs that are required. So this slide just highlights, emphasizing that the Interborough Express, even though it's a truncated version of the Triboro, is a tremendous asset. 17 routes that'll help connect Brooklyn and Queens more effectively around the city. And I have a few slides just talking about some of the data for the communities along the line. So on this map, you can see that it's largely communities of color that make up who's going to be served by this line. Almost a third of residents along the line work in service occupations, and almost 40% are low-income households. So really, the Interborough Express is an equitable transit project. It's providing better service to improve access to opportunity, to improve quality of life for communities that for too long have been left behind, that are living in transit deserts, and have been, getting pushed out of transit-rich areas. So, it's about time an investment like this happens, and we're excited to see it moving forward. This slide just shows another breakdown of the population that will get served by the line. And it's important to note, as Kate talked about, these numbers are projected to continue to go up as we see new patterns of employment, commercial centers, and where people decide that they want to live in our city. The MTA has estimated that in the coming decades, the corridor itself will see around 1 million residents and close to 300,000 jobs. So really, it's not just about investing in a need that's been in place for so long, but it's about thinking towards the future and making sure that the city is able to serve residents outside of Manhattan better. And here is just a slide, a graph that shows the different densities along the corridor. And you can see that a large portion of the corridor is already zoned for medium and high residential density. And this again just speaks to the tremendous need that's been in place for so long, and which is why the ridership numbers are so high, even for a shorter version of the Triboro. And I'm sure you all heard the note about the line itself. The MTA is estimating that the time from Bay Ridge, Brooklyn to Jackson Heights, when the line is complete, will take about 40 minutes. When we were doing more work around the Triboro, we had created these time savings estimates. And this, as was shown in the video, this gives you a sense of what kind of time savings, so if you're commuting from Jackson Heights along the line, you could realize. And as we talked about, if a student is going to Brooklyn College and saving over 30 minutes or more per trip, it's a tremendous asset, it's a tremendous improvement in quality of life to gain an hour of your day back. And if we, just think about it for yourself, what that could mean for your life if an hour a day was given back to you. So before I get into, some of what the MTA has already found and what they're starting to do, I just want to talk about, this big issue, which is the freight service. We know that right now the line is seeing very limited freight traffic. I think it's somewhere around three freight trains a day, but we absolutely need to be expanding freight. Our region is continuing to grow. We've seen during the pandemic a tremendous need to get goods moving around the region. And because of the way our network is set up, we just are not able to get freight rail moving efficiently. And so part of this project is going to be looking at how we mingle passenger service and freight service so that we can continue to expand, we continue to get trucks off the road and meet some of our climate change goals. And the good news is that around the country and around the world, this has already been done. Chicago is one of the central areas for freight rail in the country. They've been able to successfully mix freight and passenger service, and they see pretty big volumes every day. And in London, it's a much bigger line in London. It's something like over 50 miles and over 80 stations. But a third of Londoners are able to access the line within 15 minutes, and 400 million tons of cargo are served on this line annually. So, there is a possibility to continue to grow freight and mix in passenger service so that everyone is served. Now, the Interborough is not as large, 14 miles versus 53, but the MTA has already shown that there's a tremendous need. As you can see on this slide from them, there are more Brooklyn and Queens residents commuting between those two boroughs than they are going into Manhattan. And as jobs and population continues to grow, these numbers are going to simply increase. And what that means is if you don't have access to a car, you are stuck in these long, circuitous commutes, sometimes taking over an hour each way. And if you do have the means, you're getting in your car, you're driving around, you're contributing to congestion and pollution and taking us further and further away from our health and climate goals. but we can't actually ask people to ditch their cars if there's no meaningful alternative. And what the Interborough does is really presents a tremendous opportunity to provide an alternative to cars and really serve such a large portion of our city. Now I'll talk briefly about what the MTA has narrowed in on. Through the feasibility study, they were able to look at, they're now focusing on 3 modes of transportation along the corridor. And one thing that is, I think new for us and pretty great is that they have committed to having separated passenger and freight traffic. So that'll dedicate 2 lanes for passenger service and preserve the dedicated freight tracks so that it reduces conflicts along the corridor. The conventional rail model would be, it meets some of the federal regulations so that they wouldn't have to physically separate the trains. They're also going to be looking at light rail. In this situation, there would need to be some separation. So if portions of the corridor are not wide enough, you would see issues like needing to build an elevated viaduct or even some construction on the streets to make sure that the regulations are met. And then the third option that the MTA is going to be looking at is bus rapid transit. And this would be, again, fully separated, similar to light rail, require some combination of street and elevated viaduct along the corridor. And I think it's important to note that, so this would be an all electric fleet, but in order to maintain the same capacity that light rail or conventional rail would have, the bus frequency would have to be increased because obviously the cars are smaller. And then on this slide is just the MTA was highlighting some of the constraints that they have to look at. These are all of the issues that we talked about. This is why a feasibility study is important. Taking a look at the clearances and the storage needs is what we need to get details on, so we understand what kind of property acquisition is going to be required, what kind of expansion and construction is going to be required, and that ultimately decides how long this project is going to take, how much it's going to cost. And so we're hoping that through the environmental review, we get a lot more detail on that. So this is my last slide. All of this information is in the feasibility study that the MTA released yesterday. And while it is still, a conceptual study, there's a lot of detail in it, and it'll give you a lot of great understanding of what this project can mean for Brooklyn and Queens. And this slide just shows what the MTA's next steps are. And really, I encourage everyone to get involved if there are public engagement opportunities that come up. Despite the kind of impact that this project could have, I mean, we need to keep momentum up. We need to continue showing support for it. So any opportunity to talk to your electeds, to talk to other stakeholders, to get more people educated about this project, I think is really key. And, there is a possibility that the environmental review that the MTA is going to undertake completes as they start building out their 2025 to 2029 capital program. And so, if things line up, if the study goes well, if the funding gets lined up, and if it gets included in the capital plan, there is a chance that this could get, we could see this realized by the end of the decade. But again, I really think it takes all our stakeholders to really keep momentum going and see it through. So that's it on my end. I'll turn it back to Kate briefly.
Hi, and I just, in case you're interested, you want to follow up with us afterwards, we have a series of other priorities we're working on this year. Some are listed here, and there's much more. We're very busy. So if there's anything that you see on this slide that you want to talk to us more about, we're always happy to do that. Anything from funding for the MTA's capital program to supporting offshore wind, emissions reductions in buildings, to legalization of accessory dwelling units and more transit-oriented development. A lot of these proposals have actually come out by Governor Hochul, and we've been working with her and her office to try and advance a lot of these ideas. And we welcome your interest and conversation around all of that. And this is just how to get more involved. If you want to hear from us, want to be on our mailing list. And thank you so much for your time. I hope this gave you a little bit of an overview of the Interborough and how it kind of connects back to some of the history of growth and development in New York City and the region.
Kate, Kate, thank you so much. Kate, thanks so much. We really appreciate it. Kate, can you hear me?
Thank you for having us. Yep, thanks for having us.
Excellent, great. So folks, again, we were honored and kind of thrilled to be asked to go to Brooklyn, where I had to bring my visa and my passport to get down there, all kidding aside, with the governor and the two borough presidents, as well as our friends from the RPA, to hear about this feasibility study. And so I want to thank again publicly Tom Wright, Maulin, and Kate for their hard work over the years. At the conclusion of this, everybody who's registered, I will email a copy of that feasibility study, which was released yesterday, just so you have it in your hands. And I also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge a couple other friends and partners. I want to thank the Brooklyn Chamber, Randy Pierce, who was with me yesterday and is on this call today, as well as our friends from ABNY, the Greater Jamaica Development Corporation, and of course the MTA. That's kind of the glue that keeps all this together. I also want to thank somebody who helped fund this study and who's a proponent of rail like I am, and that's our dear Senator Leroy Comrie from Southeast Queens. So, Senator, thanks for all you do all the time. If anybody else jumps in the queue, I'll make sure to recognize them as well. Here's the question. Well, we've got a bunch of them. Has any provision been made? And this is for Kate and/or Maulin. You decide which one wants to answer. Has any provision been made towards integrating the IBX with the proposed Cross Harbor Freight Tunnel that was talked about yesterday by Congressman Nadler?
Yeah, so I'll start, and then Maulin, if you want to jump in. We've supported enhanced rail freight movement across the region. It's vital to reducing truck traffic. So we've been watching the Cross Harbor Tunnel EIS for many years very closely. The environmental impact statement, the initial one for that project, even if it gets built and you have sort of the maximum amount of freight trains on the Interborough, on the Bay Ridge line, which is where the Interborough would run, you'd still only be seeing 16 to 21 or so freight trains per day. And so there's plenty of capacity there for the transit service as well. As Maulin indicated, the MTA is looking at a situation for some of the modes where they would actually separate out the freight from the passenger service. So the answer, I guess, in short, is yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Next question up on our list here is, what is the timing of this, and when is the expected completion date? If anybody has an answer to that, our friends at the RPA.
So I think I mentioned it towards the end. So, we don't have a hard timeline from the MTA, but I think it's fair to estimate that if the environmental review commences, it could be completed in the next few years and in time for consideration for the 2025 to 2029 capital program. But I think there's a lot of things, not just the environmental review, but funding and other things would need to be in place to make that a reality. But so that's the estimate right now.
Yeah, and obviously the more political support this has, the faster it will move. A lot of projects do get bogged down because of various discussions with local stakeholders. So to the extent people have expressed their opinion early in the process and sort of weighed in early, I think it will help it move forward at a faster pace.
That's great. Thank you for that. As folks know who know me in the chamber, I've been an adamant and steadfast supporter of the LaGuardia Air Train, which is now being re-reviewed at the request of our governor, who made that decision very, very early in her term when she started in August. And we eagerly await that. But we do have a question here from someone that says a spur to LaGuardia and the Jamaica station for the JFK Air Train would solve the issue of expedited service to the airports. Rail certainly would. That's my comment. Which are the largest employers in Queens that would draw this? So I would kind of answer that with, folks that work at the casino, folks that work at Citi Field, folks that work in and all around the borough of Queens, I think would benefit greatly from this. And as a sidebar, when you study the history of rail and transportation from like the turn of the last century, the 1900s, you need to remember that the farms to the east of us on Long Island, whether they were oysters, strawberries, potatoes, what have you, their main destination for customers was the city of New York, hence the growth of the east-west transportation. after the wars, both the World War I and then World War II, and the pop-up of all these suburban communities in Long Island that continued to foster rail service east and west. And I'm going to ask Kate and Maulin, it's probably been within what, the last 20 or 30 years that there's been intra-borough jobs that people, instead of going to be Manhattan centric. Can you guys comment on that as far as the transportation needs and the growth of intra-borough, meaning Queens and Brooklyn workers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It definitely the past couple of decades, you've seen a lot of small businesses pop up and all across the boroughs. You've seen actual like regional job hubs start to pop up, right? Along the waterfront, for example, downtown Brooklyn. So you have seen that. And regionally, we've seen that over the past couple of decades, more people commuting to some of these sort of regional hubs. So for example, we've seen a big growth in off-peak commuting from the Bronx to White Plains. So that is something that's going on. I think it's great that we are focusing growth and development in these central hubs. Where it gets concerning is sort of what we've seen in history, where it leads to sprawl and sort of a lack of focus of development, both in housing and commercial. And that can lead to all kinds of environmental and equity issues. But luckily, I think what we've been seeing recently is just a much greater focus on ensuring that the benefits Manhattan has seen in terms of job growth aren't exclusive to Manhattan, that you do see centers in Queens, centers in Brooklyn, centers in the Bronx, centers in Westchester, centers in Long Island that are transit oriented, that are near public transportation, really get some of the job growth as well.
Great, thank you for that, Kate. Maulin, this question's for you, I think, because it's a nuts and bolts one, and you did a great job of explaining where we've been and where we're going. Somebody asked a question about, are only 2 of those tracks now operational? And in fact, I would add to that question, how many tracks are in fact currently in place there?
So there are segments where there are there's space for the 4 tracks, but things have been taken out over the years since it's been cut down to limited freight service. I believe it's 2 tracks and in some places 1 right now. So there's going to be a need to expand some of that infrastructure, but because it's grade separated, because it's already there, that makes it a little easier for the MTA, and we think cuts down on costs. But the space is there in many parts of the corridor.
That's great. As a follow-up to yesterday's conversation with Jano Lieber, it was funny. He made a comment about this is intrinsically less expensive than a tunnel project because we're not drilling through bedrock. 50, 75, or 100 feet or more below the surface. This is already established right of way and so on. Another question I have here is a general concern or question. And again, we're the Queens Chamber of Commerce, but we're all New Yorkers, right? So we're big picture people here, right? At the Chamber and of course at the RPA. I have a couple of comments here about the Bronx not being continued on as the original plan was. Can you guys address that via some of the comments that we heard yesterday at that press conference from Jano Lieber, who is now officially the MTA leader, and as well as the governor?
Yeah, I can start, and Maulin talked a little bit about it in his presentation. I mean, first, there is a project called Penn Access, which is using the Bronx right of way that we had identified for the So that project is underway. It is a great project. It will add 4 new commuter rail stations to the Bronx, and then that will provide direct service into Manhattan. And so that's one big issue, is that especially if you look at the Hellgate, the bridge that connects the Bronx and Queens, for transit service, it's got capacity constraints, and so that's one big challenge, and one reason I think the MTA is pursuing the Brooklyn and Queens portion first, and we hope they continue to look at future ways to get better regional connectivity, and I know they always are, and we'll continue to do that. But we did actually identify that if you had to do a phase of it first, that the Brooklyn and Queens portion had a little bit higher ridership. The ownership issues, MTA already owns a big chunk of the line, so it kind of made more sense to start there for a bunch of for those reasons and others as well. And Maulin, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think just the greater ease with doing work along the corridor that is already controlled by the MTA, I think it is a really good reason to move forward on that portion first. And I think one thing we don't want to do is be in a situation where we end up losing the ability to do any of this because the constraints on one end overcomplicate the project and make it kind of cost ineffective and all that. So I think it as an incremental kind of process, I think this makes the most sense right now, especially given Penn Access and all the other issues going on.
Agreed, and it seems like the MTA has addressed those concerns about commuter transport up at those new stations in the Bronx. So thank you both for your comments. As folks know, we are a membership and a advocacy organization for our members, and one of those members is the New York Atlantic Railway. I have not yet had a chance to speak to those folks. They were mentioned in some detail at yesterday's presentation. So to be fair about it, I'm not going to make too many comments about it, but Maulin, you made it really clear that, as Congressman Nadler said, and also things like getting more cars and trucks off the road is critically important to our traffic situation and our climate situation in general. Can you just add a little bit more depth to the impact and the importance of freight to this equation, and the fact that it looks like from the feasibility study, these two things, both passenger and freight, can coexist in a positive way?
That's right. I mean, we've seen it done, like I said, in different places around the country and around the world. And, as Kate alluded to, like there's a tremendous capacity. There's still unmet capacity on the existing line. So any investment in the line will just add more of that capacity. And we need to just make sure that we can properly get the freight onto the rail and just create the hubs so that we can start moving things out to Long Island and further up north without needing more truck traffic. I think the stat is that 90% of our freight is trucked around the city. And so there's a tremendous need to sort of invest in the infrastructure that gets that number down. And I think it goes hand in hand. Having the line separated allows for both to continue with less conflict and less choke points. And so we're just looking forward to seeing what the environmental review says and what kind of capacity increase we can see.
That's excellent. I'm getting a lot of questions in the chat that are kind of on the micro level, which are all those questions are will be respectful towards those questions, but a lot of it is minutia regarding MWBE participation, which the state of New York does a very, very good job. If the airports are any indication as this thing goes forward, I would not see any reason why they would not have a significant MW, but it's way too early to answer those questions in any specific way. Somebody did ask, could you guys repeat from the RPA the estimates of the daily ridership?
So the original Triboro, when we had crunched the numbers, was our estimate was around 100,000 daily riders. And I should add that those estimates were done while, as the boroughs were still growing. So it was probably an undercount. The MTA is estimating that along the Interborough corridor, looking at around 88,000 up to 88,000 daily ridership. So it's a huge number just on that portion of the line.
That's great. And then it's also going to feed lots of those other, what were there, 17 rail lines? Sorry, 17 subway lines to connect?
Yeah.
It's a remarkable number. And hopefully with the potential for a spur, or whatever you want to call it, whatever we'll call it, to the airport could be even greater, which is a great opportunity, again, to get more cars and trucks off the road and more people and product and freight onto rails. I'm going to give a shout out one more time. It's 10:50. If anybody has any other questions, please ping us before we do comments and wrap this thing up. Somebody made a question here. The last question that came in. not sure if the question was already answered, but what would the fair look like? Would it be part of the MTA? It's fair to say, Kate and Maulin, this is an MTA project, correct? At the end of the day?
Yeah, correct. So they'll be looking at that as part of it. And I think, you know, they'll take into consideration whether it's a commuter rail, whether they're doing bus rapid transit. So that's all to be determined.
Excellent. All right, so I'm sure everybody in this world would like to get another 5 or 7 minutes back in their busy work days. It is a Friday, it's 10:50. Before I wrap up, I'm going to give the floor to Kate and Maulin for any closing remarks, and also to address from an RPA perspective and also from an MTA perspective what we learned yesterday. What are next steps and closing thoughts on the project in general?
Great. Well, I want to thank you all so much, and Tom and all your members and everyone on the call today. It's a real honor to be able to talk to people about this. I feel very passionately and personally about this project. I think it's a really good one. And I've never actually seen so much support for an idea out there before than we've seen and for this one. So it's been actually refreshing to work on this when you work on a whole array of controversial topics. So I hope folks get involved. The environmental review process will be moving forward for this, and there's plenty of opportunities for engagement. If we can ever be of a resource to anyone on this call for any technical questions or any just wanting to understand the process, we're happy to be that resource. So thank you so much again, and that's all I'll end with.
Thank you so much, Kate. Pleasure to have you here, and nice to see you again. Maulin?
Just echoing everything Kate said, and just want to, again, extend the opportunity. If there's anything we can answer, if there's any, any events that, could benefit from more, more discussion around the project, we're happy to be a resource and come out and talk about our understanding of the project. So just excited, as Kate said, that this is moving forward. Let's keep up the momentum.
That's great. Again, Maulin, Mehta, thank you so much for participating today. And then a couple of final comments from me. So I got to tell you, my hat is off to the governor for acting quickly and decisively to kind of get stuff done, which seems to also be our Mayor Adams' mantra of getting stuff done. She's well on the way to doing that, which we're very, very happy about. Just folks know out there that we intend to make this a very, very critical and important part of our advocacy in the months and years ahead, and a continuum as well. At the presentation yesterday, I had the pleasure of congratulating and seeing Jano Lieber. I want to have him on a program like this, maybe in person, but probably online at some point, maybe in March, to kind of, once he has a chance to catch his breath in his new role and all the things going on at the MTA. But we want to have a continuum. We're certainly going to invite our collaborators and friends, like the folks at the RPA. Until then, please feel free to reach out to the Chamber of Commerce with further comments and questions. I'm sorry we couldn't answer all of them. I intend to download the questions that we have and try to make it a point to address them individually and specifically. And then my last comment would be, in the words of an old adage, I truly hope that the re-review of the LaGuardia Air Train is that pause that refreshes, and we can find a way to have a railing to our airport after we spent so much time and effort building a world-class airport less than a mile from the Chamber of Commerce headquarters. I think it's really important that we have interoperability throughout the borough. That's all I'm going to say about that. So thanks a million, folks. It was a pleasure. Enjoy your weekend. Thanks again to Governor Hochul. Thanks again to our friends at the RPA. Have a great weekend and happy trails. Take care, folks.